For more now, we're joined from London by Yasmin Alibhai-Brown. She is a columnist for the British newspaper The Independent, and she's a frequent radio and television commentator on politics. Also with me here in the studio is Simon Marks. He is the president and chief correspondent of Feature Story News. And joining us from London is Joe Twyman. He is the head of political research at YouGov, and he provides political analysis for British and international media. Welcome to all of you to the studio. Simon, this has been called one of the closest and most important parliamentary elections in years in Britain. In fact, the British state broadcaster, the BBC, put it very well. It said, "The people have spoken and they've delivered a resounding not sure."
Yes, well, I think that's right. I mean, I think in many ways this is the most interesting election, certainly that has taken place in my lifetime, but also the least interesting election. And that may sound contradictory, but I'll explain why I say that. It's the most interesting election because I think it really is going to determine whether we are on the brink of witnessing a long era of coalition government in the United Kingdom. Is Britain about to become Israel or Italy, where there's constant decades of political haggling that go on in terms of determining the formation of government? Or is there any prospect of any kind of return to the old behemoth, titanic struggle between the two major parties, Conservative and Labour? It's the least interesting election, though, in many ways of the modern era, because on the campaign trail, issues have been really buried. I mean, there has been such little discussion of very clear differences in policies, particularly between Labour and Conservative, with, of course, the other smaller parties on the fringes, that this has been an election campaign very heavy on style and very narrow on substance.
Right, I want to get to those specific election issues in just a moment, but let's go to Yasmin. Yasmin, the opinion polls tell us that this is going to be a very close election, which I guess speaks to the fact that the electorate is very unhappy with the incumbent, David Cameron. Why are they unhappy with him?
Well, it hasn't been just the government of David Cameron, of course. It's been a coalition government. And I think it's confused people, actually. It was sort of easier when there were only two parties to think about, really, and, you know, the other bits, kind of little canapes on the side. Since the coalition government, which has been running this country, people had to get used to a different style. For example, they don't know who to hate more. Do they hate the Lib Dems or the Tories if they don't like any of the policies? Do they love the Lib Dems if they feel that the policies were softened? Do they hate the Tories because they allowed the Lib Dems to dilute real conservatism? It's been confusing.
The Lib Dems, of course, being the Liberal Democrats who are governing in coalition with the Conservatives right now. Joe, what is the likelihood that we would see a change in government?
Well, it's certainly a distinct possibility, but we're entering a great period of uncertainty. You see, in Britain, you need to get 326 seats at the election in order to form a majority. And it doesn't look like either party, the Conservatives or the Labour Party, those two main parties in Britain, are going to get anything like that number tomorrow. And so we're left with a situation where they will have to bargain with different parties in order to achieve something approaching that all-important 326. Now, the Conservatives are likely to go towards the Liberal Democrats and say, hey, let's get the old band back together again. They are the ones that have been working in coalition now for the last 5 years, and so I imagine they'll want to carry that on. David Cameron, as Prime Minister, constitutionally gets first refusal when it comes to forming a new government, so he'll get the first bite at the cherry, as we say. However, on the other side of the political spectrum, we have Labour, who may indeed receive fewer seats than the Conservatives, but they may be able to top up their political bloc by getting the Scottish National Party, who are likely to win themselves, let's say 30, 40 or perhaps even 50 seats. And so that could form a rival bloc, and both of those blocs could have, firstly, similar numbers in terms of total number of seats, and secondly, then not enough to get the 326. And really the result in terms of who becomes Prime Minister may not be the result of public opinion directly, but instead the result of these political negotiations and the kind of deals that can be struck. And then it will become a discussion about, right, well, who has the most solid of the two agreements, and indeed which one the public supports in theory. It's going to be a great period of uncertainty, and we really don't know what the outcome will be, even this close to the election.
Right, it all gets down to the arithmetic post-election.
And can you imagine sitting in the White House, just a few blocks from where we sit, bathing as you do regularly in the language of the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, and now having to sit back, if you're Barack Obama, and potentially waiting weeks for the conclusion of some kind of coalition negotiations in Britain, and then wondering if, in fact, there might have to be a second election further down the line. I mean, the old days of straightforward opposition politics. I mean, you know, the House of Commons in London is built for that screaming session between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, diametrically opposed physically in the place where they sit in the House of Commons. All of that comes up for grabs if one truly enters one of these very complicated coalition calculations that Joe was talking about.
Go ahead, Joe.
Sorry, I was going to say the era of two-party politics is clearly over in this country. Back in 1951, over 80% of the entire adult population voted either Conservative or Labour. So not the electorate, the entire adult population. By 2010, that figure was just over 40%. We've gone from a two-party system to a 3, 4, 5 multi-party system. And so it makes things difficult because the electoral system, as you quite rightly pointed out, is geared up for two parties. And it's that clash between the two systems that makes my job as a pollster so difficult to predict.
Yasmin, Ed Milliband.
Can I just say that...
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, can I just say, I don't share the pessimism. I think a time comes, societies change. And the thing I think that both America and the UK share, it's a kind of Anglo-Saxon thing really, is that there is sometimes not much to choose between the two major parties when it comes to the economic principles and beliefs and values about what the country needs. They've been they've dissolved into each other. And that's the problem. The electorate hasn't had the kind of clear choice it once did between the sort of left and the sort of right. And I think that is why the appeal of the smaller parties has grown, because there are many in the smaller parties who are saying the unsayable. We don't like this globalized economic system, for example. We don't approve of austerity. And I think that's no bad thing.
Simon, not much difference between the parties on specific issues, as you've pointed out, but what will be preoccupying the minds of voters as they go to the polls?
Well, I think it's pocketbook issues, isn't it? I mean, I think it's generally pocketbook issues, especially, you know, this is not the kind of old-style election campaign where, when I was a kid, the Labour Party was proposing unilateral nuclear disarmament and the Conservatives were espousing the property-owning democracy that Margaret Thatcher wanted to introduce to the country. I mean, the differences between those major parties are now much more narrow. Pocketbook issues, given the nature of the economic vicissitudes that Britain has been living through, will undoubtedly guide people. But I think in the back of the minds of many voters will be the fact that there are at least two great issues that this election won't solve, but may play a role in solving. Is Scotland at some point going to have another referendum and perhaps declare independence? And secondly, what role, if any, will the United Kingdom play in the future of the European Union? Those two issues will not be decided by this election, but this election will frame the tapestry in which they will eventually be determined.
Right, I want to look at one other issue, and that is the broad foreign policy of the United Kingdom. Yasmin, Ed Miliband, who could become Britain's next Prime Minister, he said this during one of the televised debates. Let's watch.
We've got to learn the lessons of the past. We can't have Britain thinking it can solve the problems of the world on its own with the United States. That is the lesson of the 2003 Iraq War. But at the same time, we can't withdraw from the world, because otherwise those problems will visit us here at home.
So listening to him, what kind of a man is Ed Miliband? What can you tell us about him?
Well, one of the things about Ed Miliband, and I actually do respect him, I've found the attacks on him, some of them intensely personal, quite disgraceful, really. Remember, he's untainted by the Iraq War. He wasn't there to vote. I don't know how he might have voted. His brother David voted for the war and was implicated in all that happened after the war. So in a way, he has this clean report card, really, to sell, and he does it quite well. But the more important point he made, and I think this is very important, that maybe the way the Anglo-UK alliance has gone for a very long time, since the Second World War, will be shifting. In which way, we don't know. But that old order, that special relationship, is now, of course, in direct competition, if you like, with a working EU. And I think if we have a referendum and whatever is decided, that relationship is going to shift. And Ed Miliband is probably aware of that.
Joe, you mentioned the smaller parties that will be taking part in this election in Britain. There's, of course, the Liberal Democrats, there's the Scottish Nationalist Party. There is also a party known as the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP as it's known. How do you expect these parties to fare?
Well, it's likely that they will fare quite well in terms of share of the vote, and so we would expect UKIP to get, for instance, over 10% of the vote, which is a substantial improvement over the 3% that it got last time. But it's unlikely to win many seats. We don't have a proportional system in Britain. Instead, we have what's called first past the post, where individual constituencies are competed on an individual level. And we expect UKIP to maybe manage 3 seats, perhaps 5, which will be certainly lower than their share of the vote. They'll come second in a lot of places, and what they'll be hoping for is to be able to hold some sort of influence, perhaps even the balance of power in negotiations that then result from this. But I think it's very unlikely that the Liberal Democrats would want to go into any sort of formal arrangement with UKIP and the Conservatives. Instead, I expect UKIP to bide their time, to not enter the government formally, but instead to hope to carry sway on particular issues, and in exchange for that, to push forward legislation on, for instance, most importantly, a referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union, which is one of their core issues.
Simon, what are your thoughts on Britain's role in the European Union? David Cameron and his Conservatives say they will hold a referendum on Britain's continuing membership of the EU. Is that going to be a big issue?
Well, look, David Cameron and his Conservatives have been constrained in terms of what they can do by the existence of the UK Independence Party. It has forced David Cameron to move to the right on a number of issues where he may not chose to have done to have made that kind of a move had they not been around. In a referendum on European Union continued membership is a very dangerous issue for those people who want Britain to remain within the European Union, because it is quite conceivable that you would see a majority voting to leave. And so this is going to constrain all sorts of discussions that take place between London and Brussels, and between the next British Prime Minister and other European leaders, who must by now themselves, these other European leaders, be ready for Britain to make a final decision, in or out, with us or not, because this situation in which Britain has prevaricated around this issue, going back 25 years, has always been problematic in terms of Britain's bilateral relationships with other European leaders.
Yasmin, we've got a few seconds. I know you want to say something about this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think why the EU has put up with this behavior it astonishes me, you know. We've been so badly behaved, so uncommitted. If it was a marriage, it wasn't a marriage that the other party could have trusted for 5 minutes. But yet, and this is interesting, I speak to so many people and they say things like, but somehow I do feel European. I didn't think I would, but you know, I've just been speaking to an audience, an Anglo-American kind of club, and they said, well, now when I go to America, I do feel really more European. So culturally, there's been a shift, although politically, millions of people in this country think they want to leave Europe. I think when the time comes, I don't think they will.